I'm Dr. Mohamad Mikati. I'm the director of the AHC clinic at Duke, and I'm also the chief of pediatric neurology at Duke University. I've had a long history with AHC from when I was a junior faculty at Harvard, and it's been a disease that I've cared a lot about, and in the past couple of years since we discovered the gene through a collaboration between international collaboration and with Duke, we felt that the time is ripe to try and address the problems that the patients with AHC have. Their problem is not just hemiplegia, even though the disease is called alternating hemiplegia. They have so many problems. The disease is kind of many disorders wrapped into one. So their care needs a multidisciplinary approach. The way I think about AHC is it's a disease that has features of cerebral palsy, which has developmental delay and motor control abnormalities. And AHC patients have that. So it's very similar to that. It is similar to patients with stroke, because patients have weakness and on one side than on the other. And very often they have long-term problem with movement. And even though the hemiplegia recovers, but they have to deal with their acute problem like you deal with an acute stroke or at least hemiplegic migraine, where patients have weakness for a period of time. So that's another disease. So it's like cerebral palsy, like stroke. It's like epilepsy, because they have very often epileptic seizures. It's also like attention deficit disorder and behavioral problems, because these kids also very often have attentional problems. Very often they have sleep problems. Very often they have other movement problems, particularly dystonias, which are difficult to control. That's a movement problem. So it's multiple diseases wrapped into one, and it's tough enough to deal with one of those diseases. It's tough enough to deal with CP. It's tough enough to deal with epilepsy. It's tough enough to deal with the stroke or hemiplegic migraine. It's tough enough to deal with attention deficit. It's tough enough to deal with a movement disorder like Parkinson. Yet these little kids, who are very brave, very engaging, have to deal with all of that, and their care needs to address all those aspects. And the only way to try and do that successfully, we thought, was through a multidisciplinary clinic that gets specialists from all these disciplines together and talking to each other and addressing the problems of these kids at the same time. And that has worked very well for our patients. And we've had a lot of positive feedback from people who have gone through that. And I think the future for the AHC care is to emphasize that multidisciplinary aspect and recognize that none of us can deal with the problem alone. It needs a collaborative effort, like it takes a village, as they say. I think maybe the worst part is kind of the best part in many ways. These kids are such delightful kids who have such love of life, and they have such zeal, and they have such drive to want to do stuff, to enjoy, to interact, yet they are held back by this disease, by these episodes, by what I just described, by the weakness, the dystonia, the seizures. So whereas this is the most positive part about them is they're all delightful. They're all engaging. They're all like the little engine that could. That they always want to do stuff, yet they are held back by their disease. So that tension that occurs is the most difficult part. Yet it is the most invigorating and the most stimulating thing for us as professionals to try and help them. It's really inspiring to see a kid who wants to interact, wants to do stuff, yet they cannot move any parts of their body for hours sometimes on end, and sometimes even longer. I think there are a lot of things you can do for AHC. Now there is no cure, but of course we're working for a cure. We'll talk about the basic science research that we and others are doing. But there is a lot that you can do. The number one is diagnosing the problem and knowing what is really happening, because the main problem for these kids is that they are diagnosed as usually as intractable epilepsy, and epilepsy is only one part of the problem, and sometimes some of them you don't even have it. So the main thing is to know what you are dealing with, because when you know what you're dealing with, then you direct your management toward that. So initially, diagnosis is very important. And now we have the gene test that helps us, and that's part of what we offer in the clinic is free gene testing for those who have not had that. And so that's number one. And once you know what it is, then you don't go on a limb treating them with medications that would only cause side effects and not help them. So if somebody is not having seizures, you don't need to keep piling medications for seizures that would just cause side effects and hold them back, which is very often the case. Almost everybody ends up along that route until they are diagnosed correctly. So sometimes not doing the wrong thing is a treatment short of giving the treatment for a specific symptom. But now we also have treatments that we can apply to the problems that the kids have. Of course, for the hemiplegic spells, the most effective medication so far is flunarizine. There are other medications that can also help. So once you figure out what type of spell they are really having, then you can direct your treatment. If it is the hemiplegia that is affecting them, then you direct your treatment to the hemiplegia. If it is seizures, then you direct your treatment to the seizures. So very key is, again, I go back to the same thing, knowing what is going on and listening to the patient and understanding what they are. Because you get 10 patients with alternating hemiplegia, and each one has 10 plus types of spells, because they have different combinations of spells, and you need to tease them out to know, is their main problem this or that or a combination? So once you've figured that out, then you go ahead and treat the seizures, the hemiplegia. If it is dystonia, then you can treat the dystonia. Also, you listen to them. Again, listening to them. If they're having problems sleeping, then because that could affect the behavior the next day, then you address that. Sometimes, particularly in their interaction, the main problem are not the spell. It is the hyperactivity and the impulsiveness they have. So you need to address that. And there are behavioral management techniques. There are medications that you can use for that. And then you look at the other aspects. If they're having difficulty learning, then so you address that, you do neuropsychological testing, and then you address that by giving them the support for that. And so, whereas there is not a cure yet, but there is a lot you can do. And maybe the most important thing is listening to the patient and understanding what they're going through and helping them out navigate the medical environment, which can be very foreboding and very difficult, is a very important thing that you do. And that's what is intended by the multidisciplinary clinic, and that's what Lindsay does, and that's what we all do. Alternating hemiplegia is, like many diseases, has a spectrum of severity and spectrum of symptoms. And probably more than any other disease I know. I mean, I'm a pediatric neurologist and epilepsy specialist, but I was fascinated by this disease because it has such a rich repertoire and combination of symptoms that really are very on first look, mind-boggling and represent a big challenge. But now we understand much more. And when we did our study where we looked at all the North American cases in our registry, we found a big range from patients that have one spell every year or less to ones that are having spells every day, multiple times. And so all the manifestations that we talked about, whether they're the hemiplegia spells or the other manifestations, including the difficulties in learning and movement, have a range of many symptoms from severe to mild, so that there is not a one-size-fits-all treatment. It is like in all diseases in medicine, but particularly for this disease, individualization is very important, and listening to the patient is the key. Because you need to know what's going on, and very often the first thing you get from taking the history and examining the patient is just the tip of the iceberg, and then you have to go deep and then find out what is really going on. And I have patients that are on no treatment. But this is after really knowing them very well and knowing that they don't need treatment. We just observe them. Most patients, though, do need treatments, and we went over the treatments depending on what the problem is. It's not just a simple thing, give flunarizine and this is it if you have treatment. It is very important to address each and every aspect of that, particularly how the parents are able to deal with the problem, and you need to help them to deal with the problem. And as a reference center for that, we work a lot with the referring physicians. It is unusual for us not to receive emails or phone calls multiple times a week asking about patients that are not in our immediate vicinity, but their neurologist would call us and asking for guidance for how to manage the patient. I'd like to go back to a little bit to the history, because it's the AHC field has undergone a huge step forward, and in the past, we were getting something new once every 10 years or so. Like the disorder was discovered in the early, or described in the early 70s. Then a few years, 10 years later, the treatment with flunarizine was reported. Then the clinical manifestations were reported. Then we reported in the early 90s the first family that showed that this is a genetic disease. And then in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, the first gene was discovered, ATP1A2. So it's like every 10 years we were getting something. In the past 3 years, every year, every few months, we're getting something new. First, the gene discovery came, and then a multi-center, multinational, international consortium was formed. This year, we described the animal model, mouse model for that from my lab, where we had the mice that had the gene mutation that causes the AHC in humans, the most common gene mutations expressed in the mouse. And we showed that the mouse has basically the same disease. And we did neurophysiological studies to understand the underlying pathophysiology. This is providing additional insights into why things happen. We're still far from fully understanding that, but eventually work like this is bound to help us develop strategies to hopefully get better medications and better treatment. So in addition to the gene discovery that was done at Duke with an international consortium, in addition to the consortium of correlating genotype with phenotype, which is something that came again shortly after the gene discovery. In addition to the AHC clinic, which is the first of its kind anywhere in the world, but I am sure people will be doing more and more of that approach because that's what the patients need, and that's, I think, what the patients will demand, and that's the right way of addressing the problem. The mouse model, the work by many groups on the at the cellular level and the network level to try and understand the physiology, the screening of new medications that is being done by the Goldstein lab with cell cultures and the screening we are doing in slices from brains of mice that have that is all new, and it's accelerating, and it's a very exciting, hopeful time to help us help these patients eventually with better treatments, whether it is discovery, hopefully, of medications or at the clinical level to manage them better. What we have now is a mouse that has the mutation in the ATP1A3 gene. Okay. The ATP1A3 gene codes for a protein which really acts as a pump that pumps sodium and exchanges it for potassium. So it is like the battery charger, and this is a very important pump that consumes 50% of the energy of the brain. So it's a very important pump. And when it malfunctions, sodium and potassium are not exchanged as they should. So the neuron does not function well. But also that protein does not only work as a pump, but it works in controlling many other proteins and many other functions in the neuron, in the cells of the brain. So in order to solve the mystery of AHC, we need to understand how that protein is affecting not just the sodium-potassium exchange, but also how it is affecting downstream effects of all kinds of cellular function. And once we understand that better, we will be able to design medications that address the problems of AHC patients. So it may be that we will find a silver bullet that will solve the problem completely, or in medicine, usually you don't find the silver bullets, but you find maybe smaller silver bullets that address certain aspects of the consequences of the abnormality in the protein. So, but the more we understand these downstream effects, the more we are able to target the abnormalities caused by this mutation. We hope to find the silver bullet, but if we find little small bullets, that's fine. Okay. So we hope to find the silver bullet, but if we cannot find the silver bullet, I am sure we will be able to find a number of small bullets that will be able to address different aspects of the consequences of the abnormal function of the protein. And this long-term will not just necessarily help the AHC patients only, but will also probably help patients that have epilepsy and many other diseases, because that protein is also important in patients that are having stroke, is also important in patients that are having epilepsy, is also important in patients that have low blood sugar. Why? Because it consumes 50% of the energy of the brain. So any disease that stresses the brain is likely to have an abnormality in that protein and have consequences that are similar to the ones that the alternating hemiplegia patients have. Not exactly the same, but along the same lines. So understanding the pathophysiology of AHC can help millions of other patients that do not have AHC, because they're kind of the leader and the champions of many other patients that have other diseases but that have secondary abnormalities in this pump. And what we hope to do is the mice that have the knock-in mutation, the mutation that causes AHC that we developed, we are now studying how their cells are functioning and what are the downstream effects in the cells of the mice in their brain that are there. So as we decipher those in the mouse and we develop techniques to address those deficiencies, we hopefully can transfer them to the patients eventually. And that can take in the form of two things. So the development of medications can take two forms. One, understanding the underlying pathophysiology, and then tailoring, developing new medications that did not exist before that address those deficiencies. Or the other would be screening medications that are already approved and are in use for other reasons. And then if we find that they are useful in the mouse model, first in the slices, we take small slices of the brain, study them in the chamber. If they're effective in that small slice that is in a chamber, then we give it to the mouse and see if it prevents the mouse's hemiplegia, and if it prevents the mouse's seizures, if it prevents the mouse's dystonia. And then the third step would be to take it to the patients, since these would be approved medications that are already in use for other stuff. If we are synthesizing new medications, then we would have to go through first the slice step, then the mouse step, then we would need to develop the medication to be approved by the agencies in the US, it is the FDA, then to try it on patients with AHC. So there would be an extra step in that second route. At this time, we don't have any evidence that cannabidiol is going to be useful. It has not been studied in this model, but we're open to all possibilities, and we'll investigate anything that the pathophysiology or clinical experience suggests that is worth investigating. I believe, and I know, that this is a very exciting time for AHC, and very hopeful time for AHC cause, for two reasons. One, there is a unique situation where, not just with all these new discovery, but there are discoveries that have happened in the past few years, but also because of this alliance between researchers, clinical researchers, basic science researchers, and family foundations, who have been just so inspiring and so important in the pushing the envelope for the AHC cause. And I think they basically are the heart and the engine that kind of pushes everything together. And I think this alliance that comes together, the family foundations, the clinical researchers, and the basic science researchers are all coming together. So that's a very exciting thing that has happened and will continue to happen, and gives a lot of hope for the AHC cause in the future. The second reason is that it turned out that the cause of AHC is, or at least the most common cause, is the ATP1A3 mutation, which is a very important protein in the brain. It codes for a pump, the pump that consumes 50% of the energy of the brain. So it's very important. And this is likely to give a lot of importance that increases with time as people realize the importance of AHC, not just for the patients themselves and how compelling and engaging they are, but also the importance of their pathophysiology, their problem to many other diseases, since abnormal ATP1A3 function can affect all kinds of disorders. For example, patients with having frequent seizures due to epilepsy not associated with AHC. And there are millions of patients, obviously, with that. Patients that have what we call status epilepticus, continuous seizure activity. Patients that have loss of oxygen. Patients that are having loss of stroke. All these patients have a secondary problem with dysfunction in ATP1A3. So any discoveries and any increased understanding of the depth of how ATP1A3 dysfunction affects the brain can only benefit other patients that number in the not thousands, but really in the millions. I think the most important thing about dealing with AHC as a disease is not just the doctoring that you do as analysis, and is not just the research that you do as a scientist, whether clinical or basic science. The most fulfilling experience is dealing with the patients themselves and with their families. These kids, I mentioned before, but I cannot mention it enough, are so engaging, so delightful, and the families go through so much that even if there is nothing you can do, and there is always a lot that you can do a lot just by interacting with them and connecting with them, and it becomes the most fulfilling part of what you do is this personal relationship that you develop with them as a physician, or as a nurse, or as a support staff working with the AHC community. So I think I cannot overemphasize the importance of this human element that comes into play with everything that has become the AHC community.